The morning of November 25th, 1892, Cornelius Vanderbilt II stood in the smoke of his Newport cottage and watched the breakers burn to the ground in 40 minutes. The walls were marble, the chimneys were brick, the roof had been called fireproof in the contracts, and it was gone before the fire engines reached Bellevue Avenue. He was not the first Gilded Age owner to stand in that smoke. He would not be the last. 5 of the grandest mansions in America burned in the same generation. They burned for the same hidden reason, and the people who knew that reason first were the people who slept in the attics. If you enjoy long, careful stories about the houses Americans called eternal and the architects who knew they were not, hit subscribe so the next one finds you. I make these for the people who want the truth behind the marble. Chapter 1. The word that sold every mansion. Fireproof was the most expensive word in American real estate, and almost nobody asked the architects what it actually meant. In the years after the Civil War, the country had more new money than it had ever held at one time, and it was being spent in patterns the United States had never seen before. The fortunes were being built on railroads, on coal, on steel, on oil, on tobacco, and on the financing of all of them. The men who built those fortunes wanted houses that announced that the money would not go anywhere. They wanted permanence. They wanted what the European nobility had. They wanted what could not burn. So the architects of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Newport gave them the word. Every set of plans, every set of contracts, every newspaper society column that described a new house in the 1870s and 1880s used the word. The breakers in Newport, in its earliest descriptions, was called a fireproof cottage. Idle Hour on Long Island, built for William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1878, was described in society pages as fireproof. The Windsor Hotel on Fifth Avenue, completed in 1873, was advertised to its long-term residents as a fireproof hotel. The word was on every prospectus and in every brochure. In 19th century usage, the word meant something quite specific to an architect and something quite different to an owner. To the architect, a fireproof building was one whose exterior walls were stone or brick masonry, and whose main floors were brick arches sprung between cast iron beams. By that loose technical definition, almost every great house in America was fireproof. The shell was solid. The chimneys were lined in brick. The roof was tile or copper or slate. To the man who paid for it, the word meant something simpler. It meant the house could not burn. There was a gap between those two understandings. Inside the gap lived the entire hidden history of the great Gilded Age fires. A typical Newport cottage of the 1880s carried about 70% timber by volume, despite a stone face. Hartford insurance inspectors of the 1890s would later quietly write that estimate into their reports. The hollow voids inside the stud walls were timber. The servant staircases were timber. The hot air ducts ran inside timber. The window frames were timber. The roof trusses were timber. The attic floor where the housemaids slept was timber. The lath behind every plastered wall was timber. The kitchen range stood on a hearth of brick set into a frame of timber. The picture frames and the wainscoting and the floor and the doors and the moldings and the stair treads were timber. Set aflame anywhere inside the stone shell, and it had a fuel supply for 40 rooms. The architects knew. They knew because they had drawn the plans. The owners did not always want to be told. A man like Cornelius Vanderbilt II, building a Newport cottage to host the men he competed with in Manhattan, did not ask to look at the inside of the wall. He asked to look at the marble. He asked which quarry it came from. He asked when the carved capitals would be delivered. He paid the bills and trusted the word fireproof to mean the thing that it sounded like. In 1877, the firm of Peabody and Stearns broke ground on a cottage at the end of Ochre Point Avenue in Newport. The client was the tobacco heir Pierre Lorillard IV. The cottage was wood-framed, finished in stucco over wood lath, with masonry chimneys and a slate roof. It had 35 rooms. It was, in the language of the contracts, fireproof. In the language of an honest carpenter, it was a stack of cordwood with a stone face. The Lorillards lived in it for 7 seasons. In 1885, Pierre Lorillard sold it to Cornelius Vanderbilt II for somewhere near $450,000 and used the money to develop Tuxedo Park in the woods above New York. The Vanderbilts moved in. They enlarged the cottage. They held parties for the Duke of Marlborough and the cousins of the Prince of Wales. They told themselves the same story everyone in Newport was telling. They had bought a fireproof house. They had bought what could not burn. They had not. The story that this video tells is the story of how the country's wealthiest families discovered, one fire at a time, what the word actually meant. The discovery would cost lives. It would cost millions of dollars. It would, in the end, force the insurance industry to rewrite the rules of American residential construction. And it would begin, in earnest, on the night of November 25th, 1892, in Newport, Rhode Island, when the original breakers caught fire and was on the ground in 40 minutes. Before that fire, the owners believed. Before that fire, the word still sold the building. After that fire, the country was on a long, slow path to learning that the most expensive houses ever built in America were stone shells wrapped around a wooden secret. Chapter 2. The Stone Shell and Wooden Heart. A Hartford insurance inspector walked the length of Bellevue Avenue in 1893 and could not find one house built the way its owners thought it was built. His name was Marcus Holbrook. He worked for one of the half-dozen insurance houses that wrote the first generation of high-value private home policies. He had been hired in the wake of the breakers' fire of the previous November by underwriters who wanted to understand, for the first time, exactly what was inside the marble. He walked from one end of the avenue to the other. He counted. He measured. He talked to the live-in caretakers who managed the houses in the off-season. He talked to the masons. He talked to the chimney sweeps. He wrote a private report that the insurance houses circulated quietly among themselves. And that report is the closest thing the modern record has to a true inventory of how a Gilded Age cottage was actually built. The pattern was the same in every house on the street. The exterior wall was stone, or brick faced in stone, 18 to 24 inches thick. That wall would not burn. Behind that wall, almost everything else would. Most cottages on Bellevue Avenue used a method known as balloon framing. The vertical timbers ran in a single unbroken length from the basement sill to the eave of the roof. The hollow space behind the lath and plaster of every wall was therefore a single chimney, 2 to 3 stories tall, running the full height of the house. A flame at the basement could climb that chimney without ever encountering a barrier. The wider the wall, the better the draft. The taller the wall, the faster the climb. In the better cottages, fire stops had been nailed between the studs at the level of each floor. In most cottages, they had not. Holbrook found that even in houses where fire stops had been specified in the plans, the carpenters had often left them out, because the void between studs was where the electricians and the gas fitters and the plumbers ran their lines, and a fire stop nailed across the void made every later piece of work harder. Holbrook found cottages with fire stops on the plans and no fire stops in the wall. He found cottages where the fire stops were 2x4s laid loosely between studs without being nailed at all. He found cottages where the original carpenters had cut the fire stops out themselves to run a gas line. The servant staircases ran in parallel to the grand stairs, and they were, almost always, wooden. They were narrow. They were steep. They had no landings between floors. They began at the basement laundry and rose to the attic dormitory of the housemaids. The treads were yellow pine. The risers were yellow pine. The handrails were oak or walnut. The walls of the staircase were stud and lath, with paint that grew tackier each summer as the sun heated the inside of the house. A staircase like that, with a single flame inserted at the base, would draw air upward through itself the way a brick chimney draws smoke. The taller the building, the stronger the draft. The hot air ducts ran inside the same walls. Almost every great house of the 1880s was heated by a basement coal furnace, either anthracite or bituminous, with sheet metal ducts radiating outward to grills in the public rooms. The ducts ran inside the hollow stud walls. They radiated heat into the timber as they passed. Holbrook found wall cavities in which the timber had been baked dry over a decade of contact with hot ducts. He found ducts in which the seams had separated. He found ducts in which a coil of fabric, used as packing during installation, had been forgotten and was still inside, charred to a black brittle thread by the time he reached it. The gas pipes ran inside the same walls. The cottages had been built originally for gas lighting. Many had since been converted to electric, but the conversion did not mean removal. The original gas pipes were almost always still in the walls, capped at the ends. The caps were not always tight. A summer of heat, a winter of cold, the settling of a building over a decade, all of these worked the caps loose. Gas could collect in a wall cavity. A spark anywhere in the same cavity would ignite it. The kitchens were in the basement or in a service wing. The kitchen ranges burned coal or wood. The flues climbed through the building. The chimney passages were lined in brick. The brick was set against timber. The laundry was in the basement. The laundry burned coal. The laundry boiled water. The laundry handled bleach and starch and kerosene-based stain removers. The laundry generated lint. The laundry generated steam. The laundry generated open flame. Holbrook estimated that 1 in 3 serious mansion fires of the era began in the laundry. He counted the live-in servants. Most cottages of any size carried 30 or 40 in the season. Their bedrooms were almost always in the attic. The attic was reached only by the servant staircase. The single staircase was the only way out. He wrote the report. He filed the report. He went home. The insurance industry did not, that year, demand anything of the owners. The owners would have refused. The insurance industry could not yet afford to lose them as policyholders. But the report sat in a cabinet in Hartford, and it was waiting for the next fire to make it official. Holbrook wrote at the end of his report a single line. He wrote, "I have walked Bellevue Avenue and I cannot find a single fireproof house among the great cottages." Yes, Chapter 3. The decade before the fires. The summer of 1891 was the peak of a season nobody knew was about to end. In Newport that August, the original Breakers was at the center of Cornelius Vanderbilt II's social calendar. The cottage held 35 rooms. The household staff numbered about 40 in the season. The dining room had been enlarged to seat 30. The drawing room held a small but valuable collection of paintings, brought from the Vanderbilt townhouse on Fifth Avenue for the summer. The harbor below the cliff held the steam yachts of the Astors and the Golets and the Iselins. The neighbors were the Belmonts, the Wetmores, the Drexels. Every name had a railway, or a steel mill, or a bank, or a fortune in real estate behind it. That August, Cornelius Vanderbilt II hosted a luncheon for the 8th Duke of Marlborough, whose American daughter-in-law was about to bring American money to Blenheim Palace, and whose presence in Newport was itself a kind of diplomatic notice. The luncheon was reported in the papers. The papers used the word splendid. The papers used the word peerless. The papers did not use the word combustible. In Oakdale on the south shore of Long Island, William Kissam Vanderbilt's first idle hour was the center of a different kind of season. It was a country house designed for the autumn shooting and the early summer riding. It held about 100 rooms across its long, low, shingled body. The estate covered 900 acres. The household held 40 servants in the high season and a permanent winter staff of 15. William Kissam was the more sporting of the Vanderbilt brothers, a yachtsman, a horse breeder, the first president of the American Jockey Club. His wife Alva, the woman who had famously forced Mrs. Astor to accept her at the Vanderbilt Ball of 1883, treated idle hour as her own private project. She had also, by 1891, begun to plan the new marble house at Newport, which would be designed by Richard Morris Hunt and would push Bellevue Avenue's standard up another order of magnitude. In New York, Mrs. Astor still controlled the 400 families considered acceptable in society. Her annual ball was held in the ballroom of her Fifth Avenue house, which could hold 400 people when its dividing doors were folded back. The list was guarded by Ward McAllister, the social arbiter who had coined the phrase the 400. The list was, in the 1890s, the closest thing the United States had to a peerage. The Windsor Hotel on Fifth Avenue, 2 blocks south of Mrs. Astor, held a population of its own. The Windsor was a residential hotel in the European mode. It carried about 300 long-term residents in addition to its transient guests. Its residents included widows with their lady companions, retired railroad executives, elderly cousins of the Vanderbilts and the Astors who could not maintain their own townhouses. Its staff numbered about 350. Many of those staff slept in dormitories on the upper floors. The summer of 1891 ended in September. The Vanderbilts closed the original Breakers for the season. The skeleton crew of caretakers stayed behind, with a small fleet of housekeepers and the heating man who tended the basement boiler. The cottage was empty of family from late September through May, but the basement boiler ran intermittently through the winter to keep the pipes from freezing. The boiler man lived on the property. The boiler man was the only person inside the building on the night of November 25th, 1892. It would be the boiler man who saw the fire first. It would also be the boiler man whose name almost no record now preserves. In the wider world, 1891 and 1892 were prosperous years. The country was in the middle of a long industrial expansion. Railroad mileage had reached 160,000 miles. Steel production had passed 5 million tons annually. The gross national product had nearly doubled in a decade. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's annual income from his Central Railway interests was estimated at $5 million. His brother William Kissam's was very nearly the same. The money kept arriving. The country was a year from the Panic of 1893, when the Reading Railroad would collapse and the Treasury's gold reserve would fall through $100 million, and the National Cordage Company would fail, and the long depression of the 1890s would begin. But none of that was visible from a deck chair on the back lawn of the Breakers in the summer of 1891. None of it was visible from the box at Saratoga, where William Kissam Vanderbilt watched his colt run. None of it was visible from the dining room of the Windsor Hotel, where the long-term residents took their soup and looked through the tall windows at the hansom cabs going past on Fifth Avenue. The eve of the great fires looked, from the inside, like the beginning of an age that would compound forever. The boiler man at the Breakers banked his coal fire on the evening of November 24th, 1892, and went to his quarters above the carriage house. The boiler ran low through the night. Sometime after 3 in the morning, something in the heating apparatus began to fail. Sometime after that, the wall cavity around the boiler began to smolder. By 4 in the morning, the smolder had reached open air inside the wall, and the balloon framing began to do exactly what Holbrook would later describe. The original Breakers had 50 more minutes of existence in front of it. The age that no one believed was about to end, one cottage at a time. Chapter 4. The 40-minute fire. The Breakers was on fire by 4:15 in the morning, and the Newport firefighters did not finish hooking up their hoses until 5:45. The first person who saw the fire was the boiler man, John McNeil, an Irish immigrant of about 45 who had been on the Vanderbilt staff for 7 years. He had been awakened by the smell of smoke at sometime near 4. He came down from his quarters into the basement of the cottage. He found the air around the boiler hot enough that he could not stand near it for more than seconds. He saw the flames already in the wall cavity above the boiler. He understood, in the immediate way that men who work with coal furnaces understand, that the cottage was already past saving. He left the basement. He ran around the outside of the building to the gardener's cottage, where the night watchman slept. The two of them, together, broke a basement window on the seaward side to admit fresh air, an act intended as triage and which in retrospect almost certainly accelerated the spread. They ran to the gatehouse at the entrance of the property. The gatekeeper rang the bell at the gate, which woke the staff in the carriage house. Someone harnessed a horse. Someone rode 3/4 of a mile down Bellevue Avenue to the Newport Fire Department headquarters near the casino. The Newport fire engines of 1892 were horse-drawn. They were steam pumpers. The water supply they relied on was a network of cisterns and street hydrants of variable pressure. The night was cold. The hydrants nearest the Breakers were partially frozen. The pumpers had to be set up. The hoses had to be unrolled and laid across more than 200 yards of frozen lawn to reach the cliffside of the house. By the time the first pumper arrived, the fire had been inside the wall cavities for 40 minutes. By the time the second pumper arrived, the fire had reached the 3rd floor. By the time the hoses were laid, the roof was open to the sky. The fire was visible from a mile down the avenue. The night was lit yellow on the underside of the clouds. The boiler man and the gardener and the caretaker had, in those first 40 minutes, run room by room through the public rooms of the house. They had taken what they could carry. They had taken a few of the smaller paintings off the drawing room walls. They had taken the silver from the dining room sideboard. They had not taken much. The smoke had filled the public rooms within 20 minutes. The heat had broken the leaded glass of the conservatory within 25. What the staff could not save, the Vanderbilts could not have saved either. The drawing room collection had been valued at about $80,000 in 1890. The library had held a collection of about 3,000 bound volumes. The dining room had held a set of 19th-century carved walnut chairs that the Vanderbilts had bought in Paris in 1887. None of it survived. When the morning came, the original breakers was rubble inside a partial stone shell. The cliffside wall was still standing to about the height of the second floor. The landside wall had collapsed inward. The roof was gone. The interior was a mound of black timber and white plaster ash, and the twisted shapes of iron radiators and the broken glass of 1,000 windows. The boiler, which had started it, was visible in the basement where the wall above it had fallen away. It still sat on its brick pad. A telegram had gone to New York at 5 in the morning. Cornelius Vanderbilt II received it at his townhouse at 1 West 57th Street at about 5:30. He took the 8 o'clock train from Grand Central. He arrived in Newport at about 2 in the afternoon. By that time, the fire had been out for hours and the press had arrived. He walked from the gate down the cinder driveway to the front of the ruin. He stood in the smoke for some time. He spoke to none of the reporters who waited. The contemporary newspaper accounts agreed on what he is supposed to have said when he finally spoke to a foreman of the fire department about an hour later. The phrasing varied across the papers. The substance was the same. He said that the next house on this site would not burn. He said that the next house on this site would have steel and stone, and that the kitchen would be in another building. He said, according to the New York Tribune, that he had paid for a fireproof house and had received a wooden one, and that he did not intend to make that mistake again. He was as good as his word. Within 2 weeks, he had retained Richard Morris Hunt, the architect who had built Biltmore for his brother George, and the Marble House for his sister-in-law Alva. He instructed Hunt to design a replacement that could not burn. Hunt brought with him the engineer Frederick Law Olmsted as the landscape designer and the engineering firm that had pioneered steel frame construction on the new tall buildings of Chicago. The replacement breakers would have a steel structural frame. It would have brick partitions between major rooms. It would have masonry floors over steel beams. It would have a slate roof. It would have a kitchen housed in its own separate 2-story, building 150 feet north of the main house, connected to the dining room only by an underground tunnel large enough for a wheeled cart to pass. The estimated total cost was set at $7 million. It would prove low. The actual final figure, when the house was completed in 1895, would be closer to $12 million all in. In 1894 dollars, that figure was almost incomprehensible. In modern terms, it is somewhere above $400 million. Cornelius Vanderbilt II paid every bill. The construction took 30 months. The house was finished in time for the summer season of 1895. Standing in the smoke of the burned original in November 1892, he had set the engineering standard that the rest of American mansion building would eventually be forced to meet. The Breakers Fire was the first of the great Gilded Age mansion fires. It was also the first to set the architectural rules that would close the era. In 1893, however, very few owners in Newport or on Long Island or on Fifth Avenue believed that the Breakers Fire had anything to do with them. It had been bad luck. It had been a faulty boiler. It would not happen to them. It would. The next fire would burn through 100 wooden rooms in a single night. Chapter 5. The Night Idle Hour Burned. William Kissam. Vanderbilt was on a yacht in the Caribbean the night his Long Island house turned to charcoal. The yacht was called Valiant. It carried a crew of 50. It was 416 feet long. William Kissam had taken it south in early January 1899 for a long winter cruise. He had with him his daughter Consuelo, the Duchess of Marlborough by then, for 4 years, and her husband, the 9th Duke, with whom she would later quarrel and from whom she would eventually separate. They were anchored off St. Thomas on the night of January 19, 1899. The cable that reached the Valiant the next morning was the first William Kissam heard of what had happened. What had happened was that at sometime near 2 in the morning of January 19th, a fire had started in the upper floor of the children's wing of Idle Hour. The wing was 3 stories high. It was timber framed in the manner standard for the 1870s. It was finished in shingles. The roof was steeply pitched. The wind that night, off the Great South Bay, was sustained at 30 miles an hour and was gusting higher. The cause of the fire was never officially determined. The most commonly cited theory in the days that followed was a defective fireplace flue in a bedroom on the 3rd floor of the wing, in which a chimney lining had broken down over decades of summer and winter cycles. A fire had been laid in the fireplace earlier in the evening by the off-season staff and had been allowed to burn down before bedtime. A coal had escaped through the broken liner into the wall cavity behind. The wall had smoldered for 3 or 4 hours before reaching open air. The skeleton crew on duty that night numbered 18, of whom only 6 were on the main house. The rest were in the gatehouse, the carriage house, the conservatories, and the boathouse. The man who first smelled smoke was a second housekeeper named Anna Lindgren, a Swedish immigrant of about 30. She had been on the staff for 4 years. She woke the underbutler. The underbutler woke the chief footman, who had been left in charge of the main house in the family's absence. They opened the door of the children's wing and found the corridor already filled with smoke. They opened the windows on the main staircase, on the theory of clearing the air, and accelerated the fire by giving it the through draft it had been waiting for. The men ran first for the small fire pumps maintained on the property. The pumps drew from a cistern below the kitchen wing. Within 20 minutes, the cistern was dry. The wind had pushed the fire from the children's wing through the connecting gallery into the main central section of the house. By that point, the cooks had been roused. The carriage staff had been roused. The neighbors at the next property east had been roused by the light in the sky. A telegram had gone to the Sayville Fire Brigade, which arrived at 3:20 in the morning with hand-pumped equipment that was useless against a fire of the size now consuming the central section. What no one inside the house had time to do that night was save the contents. Anna Lindgren told the New York World the day after that she had taken from her own room only her shoes and her prayer book. She had not been able to enter the family's rooms. The smoke had filled them by the time she thought to try. She lost her brother's letters. She lost her late mother's brooch. She lost 2 months of her wages, which she had kept in cash in an envelope behind her chest of drawers because she did not trust the country banks. By dawn on the morning of January 19th, the central section of Idle Hour was gone. The east wing was gone. The west wing, separated from the central section by a stone breezeway, was partially saved. The kitchen wing survived. The chapel survived. The boathouse survived. About 60 of the 100 rooms were on the ground. The cable to the Valiant reached William Kissam Vanderbilt at about 10 in the morning. He read it at the rail of his yacht. He had been awake for about an hour. He was reported by an officer of the yacht to have read the cable twice and then folded it once and then said, in a quiet voice, that he supposed he would build it again. He did not return to New York for 2 weeks. He did not interrupt his cruise. He sent a second cable to his son, William Kissam Vanderbilt II, then a young man living in New York, instructing him to retain the firm of Richard Howland Hunt, the son of Richard Morris Hunt, and to begin the rebuild without delay. The replacement Idle Hour opened in 1901. It was a stone, brick, and steel building. The exterior was yellow brick with limestone trim. The frame was structural steel. The floors were concrete with tile. The kitchen wing was again separated from the main house on the model of the new breakers, with a long covered passage between them. The cost was reported variously at between $2 and $3 million, the wide range reflecting the fact that William Kissam had been writing checks personally as the construction proceeded and did not always tell his accountants what he was paying for. The new Idle Hour survives today as part of the campus of the former Dowling College. The exterior is largely as Hunt finished it. The interior has been reworked many times. The original chapel still stands. The boathouse still stands. The kitchen wing, now an administrative building, still stands. The site of the original timber-framed house from 1878 is a flat lawn between the chapel and the main building. The lawn is unmarked. Anna Lindgren left the Vanderbilt service in 1901 when the new house opened. She had married a carpenter who had worked on the rebuild. She moved with him to Brooklyn. She died in 1947 at about 79 and is buried in Greenwood Cemetery. The Vanderbilts continued to keep Long Island estates for another generation. The lesson the boiler man at the breakers had taught was now repeating itself in Oakdale. It would repeat itself a third time, in the same year, in a hotel on Fifth Avenue. The third time would not let the family go on a yacht and read the cable 2 days later. The third time would kill people. Chapter 6. When a Hotel Killed Its Workers. At 3:15 on St. Patrick's Day, 1899, the Windsor Hotel began to burn from a curtain on a third-floor window. The St. Patrick's Day parade was passing along Fifth Avenue. The windows of the Windsor were crowded with hotel residents watching the parade. A guest on the third floor lit a cigar and used the burned match to flick a small flame onto the lace curtain of his window. He did not, in his version, intend to set the curtain on fire. He may have thought the curtain was further from the match than it was. The curtain, dried by years of summer sun and held against the wall by the heavy velvet drapery behind it, ignited at the bottom edge. He tried to beat it out with his hands. He failed. He ran into the corridor and called for help. The corridor of the Windsor's third floor was carpeted in a wool and jute weave that had been laid in 1873 and had not been replaced in 26 years. The walls were paneled in oak below a chair rail and finished in painted plaster above. The wallpaper on the upper part of the walls was a sage green flock. The wallpaper was paper. Behind the wallpaper, the plaster was set on a backing of wood lath. Behind the wood lath, the stud cavities were hollow. The hot air ducts of the central furnace ran inside those cavities. The original gas pipes from the building's 1870s installation were also inside those cavities, capped at the ends. Within 5 minutes of the curtain catching, the flames had spread to the third floor corridor. Within 10 minutes, they had spread through the wall cavity to the corridor of the fourth floor. Within 15 minutes, the fire was at the main staircase. The main staircase of the Windsor ran through the lobby in an unbroken sweep from the ground floor to the seventh. Its rail was carved walnut. Its treads were oak. It functioned, the moment it caught fire, exactly as the servant staircase in the original breakers had functioned, as a flue. The hotel held 350 staff and about 300 long-term residents and about 150 transient guests that afternoon. Most of the residents and guests were already at the windows watching the parade. Most of the staff were working their normal shifts. The lobby clerks at the desk, the bellhops on the floors, the housekeepers in the linen rooms, the kitchen staff in the basement, the laundry staff in the laundry annex, the maintenance staff in the boiler room. The senior chambermaids and the senior laundresses who lived in the building were either off-duty or had just begun their afternoon work. The bellhop on the third floor, an Irish-American boy of about 17 named Patrick Doyle, was the first to ring the alarm. He pulled the floor's alarm cord at 3:16 in the afternoon. The cord rang a bell at the front desk and a second bell in the manager's office. The front desk clerk telephoned the fire department. The fire department turned out from Engine 8, less than half a mile away. They reached the hotel at 3:24. The fire had then been burning for 9 minutes. In those 9 minutes, the fire had taken the third floor corridor, the fourth floor corridor, and was in the wall cavity working upward toward the fifth, sixth, and seventh floors. The main staircase was already impassable. The two servant staircases, narrow timber stairs running from the basement to the attic dormitories, were beginning to draft. The third floor residents at the windows of the parade had a choice. They could turn back into the corridor and try to reach a stair. They could climb out of the window and hope. Many of them in those first minutes made the second choice. They climbed out onto the cornice. They held the iron of the window grills. They waited for ladders. The Engine 8 ladders reached only to the fourth floor. The hotel was 8 stories. The ladder companies of the New York Fire Department in 1899 did not yet carry the longer aerial ladders that would become standard in the decade following. The men on the 5th, 6th, and 7th floors had no exit. The chambermaids and laundresses on the upper floors had less exit even than that. Their dormitories were on the 8th floor. The servant staircase that served them had already filled with smoke by the time the alarm bell rang. The bell did not reach the 8th floor. The wiring of the servants' wing did not include the alarm circuit. The first the 8th floor staff knew of the fire was when the smoke reached them through the door frame of the staircase. Of the housekeepers and laundresses who slept on the 8th floor, 12 are recorded as having died. Their names were printed in the New York Times on the morning of March 18th. They were Mary Carrick, 23, of County Ragcommon; Hannah Murphy, 27, of Brooklyn; Bridget O'Neill, 31, of County Cork; Annie Gleason, 22, of County Galway; Mary Walsh, 29, of Boston; Catherine Brennan, 33, of County Sligo; Anna Schultz, 26, of Bremen; Ida Larson, 24, of Stockholm; Lena Mayer, 21, of Bavaria; Sarah Klein, 28, of Prague; Margaret Donovan, 30, of County Limerick; Ellen Foley, 25, of County Kerry. The total dead across the building was reported officially at 45. Estimates of the actual total ran as high as 86, counting those who jumped and were not recovered intact, and those who were too disfigured to be identified at the morgue. The hotel had been called fireproof on its prospectuses since the day it opened. The investigation took 6 weeks. Its findings were that the fire had been started by the cigar match on the curtain. Its findings were also that the spread of the fire had been catastrophic because the building's interior was almost entirely timber, because the alarm system did not include the servants' wing, because the main staircase was an open shaft from lobby to 7th floor, because the servant staircases were narrow timber chimneys with no means of containment between floors, and because the ladder companies could not reach the upper stories. The investigation report did not use the word fireproof, except to note that the term had been used in the hotel's advertising. The Windsor was not rebuilt on its site. The corner of 46th Street and 5th Avenue was sold to a syndicate that built a commercial building. The hotel's name passed out of New York. The chambermaids of the 8th floor were buried, some by their families if their families could be reached, some by Catholic charities, some by the city. The hotel's owners paid funeral expenses for the dead, whose families requested them. The owners did not, in the legal record, ever admit that the building's construction had been the proximate cause. The Windsor fire was the moment American newspapers began, for the first time, to print the question that had been unspoken for 30 years. What did the word fireproof actually mean? The architects of New York and Boston and Philadelphia, when the question was asked, answered as carefully as they could. They explained the technical sense. They explained the conditions under which a stone-faced building with timber interior framing could burn fast. They explained that the word, as used in real estate advertising, had been carelessly applied for decades. The owners and the insurance companies began the long, slow conversation that would, by 1920, produce the first national model codes. The conversation began in March of 1899 over the ashes of a hotel in Midtown Manhattan and the bodies of 12 immigrant women on an 8th-floor servants' dormitory. The Windsor fire is the fire after which, retrospectively, the era of fireproof as a real estate word began to die. It would die slowly. There were other fires still to come. Chapter 7. The Pembroke Fire. Nobody remembers. Pembroke was supposed to be the safer house because it had a stone wall instead of a wood one. Pembroke stood on the north shore of Long Island at Glen Cove. It had been built in the early 1890s by Captain Joseph Raphael de Lamar, a Dutch immigrant who had made his money first as a sea captain and then as a mining promoter in Colorado, Idaho, and Montana. De Lamar had spent about $1.5 million on the property by the time he was finished. The house held about 40 rooms. The walls were ashlar limestone 2 feet thick at the base. The roof was multi-gabled, steeply pitched, finished in clay tile. The interior was timber. De Lamar had owned the property for only a few years when his fortunes shifted. He sold Pembroke in 1899 to the steel magnate Henry Phipps II, a partner of Andrew Carnegie. Phipps held the property for about 5 years, then sold it to the financier Allison V. Armour. Armour held it for 2 years, then transferred it through a property partnership that involved several of the New York shipping families. By 1907, the legal owner was the partnership, and the property was managed by a steward. The off-season at Pembroke in early 1907 was managed by a household staff of about 12. The principal man on the property was a butler named Joseph Heinrich, German-born, 51 years old, who had been on the property since the de Lamar years. He had seen the place change hands 3 times. He had stayed because the partnership had renewed his contract each year, and because his wife was buried in the small cemetery of the Lutheran Church in Glen Cove. He had given the property his life. The fire began on the night of February 12, 1907. The point of origin, as investigators later established, was a fireplace flue in the library on the north side of the ground floor. The flue had been built in 1891. The lining of the flue, by 1907, was in a condition that nobody had checked in 15 years. A fire had been laid in the library that evening because Heinrich had been working in the room, going through the partnership's house inventory in preparation for a possible sale in the spring. He had built the fire small. He had let it burn down. He had banked the coals and gone to his rooms in the basement at about 10:30. The fire in the wall cavity behind the flue began sometime between 11 and midnight. It worked upward in the manner of all such fires, inside the unbroken void of the balloon-framed wall. By 1 in the morning, it had reached the first floor. By 1:15, it had reached the second. By 1:30, it had reached the third. What was different at Pembroke, compared to the original Breakers and Idle Hour and the Windsor, was the roof. The roof of Pembroke was very steeply pitched, perhaps 50 degrees. The pitched timber framing of the attic was exposed. The clay tiles of the exterior held the heat. When the fire reached the attic, the entire roof structure ignited at once. The clay tiles did not fall away. They held the heat against the burning timber and concentrated it. The roof became an oven. Heinrich woke at about 1:20. He smelled smoke. He came up from the basement. The hall was already filling. He ran for the fire pumps in the boathouse. He pumped for 10 minutes against a fire that was already past containment. He went back to the house. He woke the kitchen staff. The kitchen staff had time to leave. The estate's other servants were in their own quarters above the carriage house and were unhurt. No one died at Pembroke. The library, the music room, the dining room, the drawing room, the upper bedrooms, the upper hallways, the attic, and the roof were destroyed. The main staircase collapsed at about 2 in the morning. The east wing burned down to the second floor. The west wing, separated by stone, was saved. The stables and outbuildings were untouched. Heinrich stood on the lawn at 4 in the morning and watched the last of the roof timbers fall in. The newspapers the next day called it the Pembroke Fire. The story ran for a week and then disappeared. The partnership that owned the property did not rebuild. They sold the land at a discount to a development partnership the next year. The development partnership demolished the remaining shell, removed the stone, sold most of the carved stonework to other Long Island estate builders, and subdivided the property into smaller lots. By 1915, the original Pembroke property had been replaced by a dozen smaller country houses for the families of the second generation of Long Island wealth. The Pembroke fire is the fire most easily forgotten among the five. It did not kill anyone. It destroyed the property of an owner who was a partnership rather than a famous family. It did not begin a famous public conversation. It did not shape a famous rebuild. The Vanderbilts of Idle Hour, the chambermaids of the Windsor, the marble of the New Breakers, all carry their own afterlives. Pembroke became a subdivision and a footnote. Pembroke is, however, the fire after which the insurance industry began, in earnest, to charge what an honest premium for a Gilded Age mansion actually cost. 2 of the 4 Long Island insurers who had been writing policies on properties in the Pembroke class withdrew from the line in the second half of 1907. The 2 who remained doubled their premiums on comparable properties. They required, for the first time, independent fireproofing inspections before they would write a new policy. The model report they used was directly traceable to the Holbrook, Bellevue Avenue work of 15 years earlier. The inspectors who fanned out across Long Island and Westchester and New Jersey in the summer of 1907 carried checklists derived from Holbrook's checklist. They reported again and again what Holbrook had reported. The houses were not what their owners thought they were. The owners in 1907 began for the first time to listen. Some retrofitted. They opened walls and added fire stops. They replaced gas lines that had been capped. They wrapped boilers and ducts in asbestos cloth on the available knowledge of the time. They installed early sprinkler systems in basements. They added enclosed metal-lined fire doors at the top and bottom of servant staircases. The cost of these retrofits, on a major property, ran between $50,000 and $200,000. Others sold. The sale market for great houses in 1908 and 1909 was unusually active. The buyers were a new class, often the second generation of industrial wealth. Often men who would themselves build their own new houses on the new model, rather than carry the obligations of an older one. The shape of the change is visible in the building permits of Newport for the years immediately following. The number of new cottages began to decline by 1909. The number of demolitions of older cottages began to climb. The fireproof of the 1880s was being replaced, one building at a time, by a quieter, more cautious, and far less profitable kind of construction. The era was already, by 1910, beginning its slow ending. The next chapters of the slow ending would not be written by fire. They would be written by the federal government, the British Army, the Chambermaids Union, and Wall Street. But the architectural cause of the ending was already in place. Fire had set it. Insurance had recognized it. Owners had begun at last to listen. Chapter 8. The Inspector Who Walked Bellevue. A man with a notebook and a pair of polished boots walked the length of the most expensive street in America and wrote that none of it was what it claimed to be. Marcus Holbrook had walked Bellevue Avenue in 1893. He had filed his private report. The report had sat in a cabinet in Hartford for 15 years. By 1908, the inspectors walking Bellevue Avenue were no longer working privately on behalf of a single insurer. They were working under the new model contract of the National Board of Fire Underwriters, the industry association that had been founded in 1866, but that had not, until the great fires of the 1890s and the early 1900s, been able to impose a uniform standard on the high-value private home market. The inspectors of the new generation included a man named James W. Atherton, who would later become one of the founders of the National Fire Protection Association. Atherton walked Bellevue Avenue in 1909. He carried a printed checklist of 28 items. He walked the avenue from the casino at one end to the cliff at the other. He took 12 days to do it. He inspected 42 of the great cottages. He found that 31 of the 42 failed his checklist in 5 or more categories. He found that 7 failed in 10 or more. The categories were not exotic. They were the categories that any reasonable architect or carpenter or insurance writer in 1909 would have predicted. Hollow stud walls with no fire stops, hot air ducts running through timber, capped gas lines left in walls after electrical conversion, wooden servant staircases functioning as flues, basement laundries with no fire separation, kitchens connected to the main house without a firewall, bedroom fireplaces with unverified flue liners, roofs of pitched timber framed in old shingle, even where the visible roof was slate or tile, heating ducts not wrapped, not insulated, not separated from timber, and so on, in the same long pattern. Atherton's report was not private. The National Board of Fire Underwriters published a summary version in its bulletin in 1910. The owners read it. The owners on the whole did not like it. The owners began a quiet conversation with their insurers about what would and would not be required of them if they wished to retain coverage at premiums they considered tolerable. The conversation took 2 years. By the end of 1912, the new contract conditions had been imposed across the major insurers. Any house valued above $500,000 had to be inspected against the model checklist before its insurance was renewed. Any house that failed on more than 3 categories had to either retrofit or accept a premium increase of between 2 and 10 times. The premium increases were not trivial. A cottage on Bellevue Avenue insured for $1 million had, in the 1890s, paid about $1,000 a year in premium. By 1915, an unimproved cottage in the same class was paying between $6,000 and $10,000 a year. After 10 years, the cumulative increase in insurance cost was equal to the cost of the retrofit it had been intended to avoid. An owner who refused to retrofit was paying over a decade the same amount he would have paid to do the work. Some owners did the work. The records of the Newport Historical Society contain receipts from the years 1910 through 1920 for fire stop additions, sprinkler installations, servant staircase upgrades, and electrical rewiring at cottages including Beechwood, Rough Point, Marble House, and Belcourt. The work was done quietly. The owners did not advertise it. Other owners sold. The Bellevue Avenue real estate market in the years 1912 through 1916 recorded the highest volume of cottage transfers in the avenue's history. The buyers were often a generation younger than the sellers. They paid on average between 60 and 70 cents on the dollar of the assessed value of the property. They did not always intend to retain the cottages. Several of the great houses sold in that period were demolished within 5 years. Other owners simply gave up. They locked the front gate. They paid a small caretaker staff. They wrote the property off in their household accounts. They told their children that the cottage was now closed. The cottage stood empty. A peculiar feature of the years between 1910 and 1915 is the number of fires at unoccupied cottages. The newspapers in those years recorded at least 11 serious fires at Newport and Long Island properties that were no longer in regular family use. The fires occurred in winter. The cause was almost always the basement boiler that ran intermittently to keep the pipes from freezing, supervised by a caretaker who could not always be present at the moment a fault developed. The pattern of damage was the same as at the original breakers. The wall cavity ignited. The fire moved up the servants' staircase. The roof came down before the local fire brigade could reach the property. Among the great Bellevue Avenue cottages, 4 were lost in this way between 1910 and 1920. The names of the buildings are recorded in the Newport Historical Society's files. The names of the boilermen and caretakers who watched them burn are mostly not. The insurance inspectors had won the technical argument. The architects had been forced to accept the new standard. The owners had begun, in numbers that mattered, to do the work or to leave. The era of the fireproof as a real estate word had reached its quiet end. What replaced it in the next decade would be a country that had taxes and a labor market that no longer supplied the chambermaids of the 1890s. The two together would finish what fire and insurance had begun. The next chapter is about those two. Yaji Chapter 9. The Tax and the Servants. A chambermaid in 1920 earned 3 times what her mother had earned in 1890, and there were still no chambermaids left to hire. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in February 1913. It permitted the federal income tax. The first federal income tax statute, enacted in October of the same year, set a normal rate of 1% on incomes over $3,000. With a top marginal rate of 7% on incomes over $500,000. The first year of collection raised about $71 million, of which the wealthiest 1% of taxpayers paid a substantial share. The rate did not stay at 7%. The First World War, which the United States entered in April 1917, required revenue on a scale the Treasury had never previously needed. The Revenue Act of 1917 raised the top marginal rate to 67%. The Revenue Act of 1918 raised it to 77%. The top rate fell again through the 1920s, settling at 24% by 1929. The 1932 Revenue Act, passed in the depths of the Depression, pushed it back to 63%. By 1944, it would be 94%. The estate tax arrived in 1916, originally at a maximum rate of 10%, on estates above $5 million. By 1934, the top rate was 60%. By 1941, it was 77%. The fortunes of the Gilded Age, which had been able to compound across 3 generations under the system of the 1870s, could not compound across 3 generations under the system of the 1940s. The inherited Vanderbilt and Astor and Whitney fortunes shrank, generation by generation, under the impact of those rates. The shrinking was not enough on its own to end the era of the Great House. What ended the era of the Great House was the cost of running it. A great house ran on people. The original breakers had carried about 40 live-in servants in the season. The new breakers carried about 35. The chambermaid of the 1890s had earned about $15 a month plus board. The footman had earned about 20. The butler had earned about 80. The cook had earned about 40. By 1920, the same positions paid about 3 times those rates. The chambermaid earned about $45 a month, the footman about 60, the butler about 200, the cook about 120. The increases would not have been intolerable on their own. What made them intolerable was that, in addition to paying 3 times as much, an owner could no longer find anyone willing to take the job. The wartime industrial economy of 1917 and 1918 had pulled tens of thousands of young women out of domestic service and into munitions factories, packing plants, garment workshops, and the new offices of the federal bureaucracy. The wages were higher. The work, for many of them, was less personally degrading. The hours were defined. The position had no obligation to live in the employer's house and to be available every hour of the week. After the war, the young women did not come back. They could not be persuaded to go back. The supply of native-born American girls willing to take domestic service positions had been declining steadily since the 1890s. After the war, it collapsed. The supply of immigrant women who would take such positions held longer. But the Immigration Act of 1924, which sharply restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, cut off the supply at its source. By 1925, a Newport cottage that had carried 40 servants in 1895 could expect to staff its summer season with perhaps 15, drawn from a labor market that no longer reliably refilled. The cottage that had been built to be run by 40 did not function on 15. The dining room could be served, the chambermaids could be done, the laundry could be done, but the polish, the constant turning, the live in availability, the readiness of a great house to entertain on no notice, none of it could be sustained. Owners closed wings, owners closed floors, owners reduced the season from 12 weeks to 8, then to 6, then to 4. The cottages, which had been built as machines of full-season social demonstration, became, by the late 1920s, holiday houses used for a few weeks a year. The economic argument for owning them slowly collapsed. Then the 1929 crash arrived. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell from 381 points on September 3, 1929, to 41 points by July 1932. The fortunes of the Gilded Age and their heirs were not destroyed entirely. They were not, on the whole, broken, but they were damaged enough that the marginal expenses of holding a great house no longer made sense even to families who could technically still afford them. The cottages began to be sold. The cottages began to be donated to colleges and historical societies. The cottages began to be torn down. The new houses of the era, the ones built on the post-war model with steel and concrete and a small staff, did not need the chambermaid army of the 1890s. They were built smaller. They were built with smaller live-in quarters. They were built with the assumption that day staff would replace much of what had been live-in. The architectural standard the insurance inspectors had won was, in retrospect, the architectural standard the new tax and labor environment also required. The two changes were synchronized. Whitemarsh Hall, completed in 1921 for Edward T. Stotesbury, is the great exception. It was the largest private house ever built in the country at the time of its completion. It was built in steel and limestone, with separated kitchen and concrete floors, on the new fireproof model. It was fully insurable. It was technically fireproof in every sense the National Board of Fire Underwriters required. It was also, from the moment its doors opened, obsolete. Stotesbury could afford it. He had paid $5 million for the house and another $5 million for the gardens. He carried it through the 1920s and into the 1930s. His wife Eva continued to entertain the Prince of Wales and the Roosevelt and Vanderbilt cousins. The house held 147 rooms. It needed 70 servants to function as designed. Stotesbury died in 1938. The Depression had reduced his estate. The new income tax was eating his heirs alive. The cost of running Whitemarsh Hall against the income still available to the family did not work. Eva sold the contents at auction in 1943. She sold the gardens to a developer. She left the house empty. Whitemarsh Hall had been built on the fireproof standard the insurance inspectors had won. It still stood. It would stand empty for the next 10 years. What was about to come for it was not a single dramatic fire. What was about to come for it was a slow, almost decade-long ruin, ended by a small fire that should not have been able to consume a building of its scale, and that did consume it because the building had been left empty. That story is the next chapter. Chapter 10. The Whitemarsh Hall Ruin Years. Whitemarsh Hall stood empty for 10 years before the first trespasser lit a fire inside its walls. The house had been closed and locked in late 1943. Eva Stotesbury had moved to a smaller house in Boca Raton. The contents had been sold at the Parque Bernat Galleries in New York over the course of 9 days in March of that year, raising about $2.5 million against an original purchase value, the family's lawyer estimated, of more than 15. The furniture, the paintings, the books, the carpets, the chandeliers, the silver, the porcelain, all of it left the property in the spring of 1943. What remained was the building itself, 147 rooms over 6 floors, including the basement and the attic, the steel frame, the concrete floors, the limestone walls, the slate roof, the copper gutters, the plumbing, the wiring, the boiler, the interior finishes that had been built in rather than placed, the carved wood paneling, the marble fireplace surrounds, the plaster ceiling work, the parquet floors. None of it was removable without significant damage. The estate had been advertised for sale through 1943 and 1944. No buyer had appeared at any price the family was willing to accept. The carrying costs of the building, even with no occupants, were estimated at about $35,000 a year in 1944 dollars. The boiler ran in the winter to keep the pipes from freezing. A caretaker lived in the gatehouse. The grounds were tended at a minimum. In 1945, the boiler was shut down. The pipes were drained. The caretaker was retained, but his hours were reduced. The grounds were no longer tended. The drives began to weed over. The hedges that had defined the formal garden began to grow into themselves. The first vandalism is documented in the local police records of Springfield Township in 1946. A group of boys broke a basement window and entered the building. They were caught by the caretaker. The damage was minor. The window was replaced. 2 months later, another window was broken on the south facade, a more elaborate entry. Statues from the entry hall were taken. They were never recovered. By 1948, the pattern was constant. The caretaker could not be everywhere at once. The estate had a perimeter of more than 3 miles of formal boundary. The breaks in the windows were sometimes repaired and sometimes not. By 1950, sections of the lead roof had been stripped by intruders for scrap. The copper gutters were pried off and sold. The marble fireplace surrounds in the smaller rooms began to disappear. The carved wood paneling of the library, the ballroom, the dining room, the small drawing room, the music room, and the entry hall remained. It was too heavy to remove. It was too integrated into the building. It was, however, intensely flammable. The paneling was oak and walnut and Spanish chestnut, much of it dating from the 17th and 18th centuries, imported from European houses by Trumbauer when the house was built. The trespassers by the early 1960s included not only local boys, but also a more or less continuous traffic of urban explorers, photography enthusiasts, college students from the Philadelphia schools, and a category of more aggressive scavengers who came with tools and crowbars and small trucks. The interior of the building was photographed by a number of professional photographers in those years. The photographs, published in Life magazine and in the Sunday supplements of the Philadelphia papers, made Whitemarsh Hall the most famous abandoned house in the United States. The first significant interior fire was set in 1964. A group of trespassers had built a small bonfire in the center of the ballroom floor, presumably for warmth or for light. The fire did not consume the ballroom. The floor was parquet over concrete, and the parquet only smoldered. The fire was put out by the next visitors. The damage was visible but contained. A second significant fire was set in 1967. This one was in the library. The library shelves had been empty since 1943, but the carved oak shelving remained. The fire reached the shelving. The shelving burned. The plaster ceiling above the shelves collapsed. The damage to the library was total. The damage to the rest of the building was contained by the masonry partitions and the concrete floor of the next story up. The fire had been started, almost certainly, by a deliberate hand. The Springfield Township Police could not identify the responsible parties. A third fire was set in 1972, a fourth in 1976, a fifth, the final one, in 1979. The final fire began in the small drawing room on the ground floor. It was set, according to a Springfield Township Police investigator's later notes, sometime in the early hours of the morning of a day in the late winter of 1979. The exact date is disputed in different reports as January 19th, January 25th, and February 7th. The fire department records from Springfield Township have been lost. The newspapers reported the building as substantially destroyed by the morning of February the 7th. What had happened was that the carved wood paneling of the small drawing room had caught. The fire had moved through the connecting doorway into the Great Hall. The Great Hall paneling had caught. The fire had moved into the music room and the ballroom. The masonry partitions had contained the fire to the public rooms of the ground floor and the floor above. But all of the public rooms of the ground floor were destroyed. The interior of the building at that point was hollow. The plaster ceilings had collapsed across more than half of the floor area. The roof above the ballroom and the music room had partially fallen in. The Stotesbury heirs by then were a third generation. They had not maintained the property for 30 years. They had paid Philadelphia City and Springfield Township real estate taxes against assessed values that had been declining steadily. The building was, as a financial asset, of negative value. In 1980, the township issued a demolition order. The demolition was contracted to a Philadelphia firm. The cost of demolition was estimated at $12,000 in 1980 dollars. The building was brought down with explosives over the course of 3 days in May. The limestone walls collapsed. the steel frame was cut up and sold. The marble salvageables were taken to a stone yard outside of Philadelphia, where most of them remained for decades, and some of which were eventually used in the construction of other houses. The site was bought by a developer. The developer subdivided. The houses built on the lots of the former White Marsh estate in the early 1980s are of a kind familiar to anyone who knows post-war Philadelphia suburbia. The gates of the original estate still stand. They are not maintained. They open onto a cul-de-sac. The cul-de-sac is named Stotesbury Court. That is what survives. Now, in Chapter 11. What insurance made? Mandatory. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had imposed the rules on his own house in 1893, and a generation later, the rest of the country was forced to follow. The National Model Fire Codes for private residences took their first published form in 1920, when the National Board of Fire Underwriters released the model regulation that would later become the basis of the National Building Code. The regulation addressed for the first time, in a standardized form, the construction issues that had been visible in the Great Fires from the original breakers onward. The provisions of the 1920 Model Code, as applied to high-value private residences, mandated several things that would have transformed the original breakers had they been in force in 1877. Fire stops in all stud cavities at every floor level, steel framing or, at minimum, brick masonry partitions between major rooms, enclosed metal-lined fire doors at the top and bottom of all service staircases, separated kitchen wings or detached kitchen buildings. For residences with more than 30 rooms, independent boiler rooms with fire separation from the rest of the building, wrapped or insulated hot air ducts, inspected and certified flue liners on a 5-year cycle, removal or certified capping of all gas lines after conversion to electrical lighting, sprinkler systems mandated for any building over a defined occupancy and floor area threshold. The provisions of the 1927 National Fire Protection Association standard went further. Sprinklers became mandatory for any private residence over 20 rooms. Fire alarm systems became mandatory for any building with live-in staff in upper-level dormitories. Servant staircases of timber became prohibited in any new construction over 3 stories. The architectural standard Cornelius Vanderbilt II had imposed on the new breakers in 1893 was now imposed on the country. The owners of older houses who had not by then retrofitted had a difficult choice. The provisions applied to new construction. They did not, in their initial form, apply retroactively. But the insurers, who set their premiums and their writing standards independently, treated the standards as a model. An older house that had not been brought up to standard could be insured, but only at premiums 2 to 5 times the rate for a code-compliant building of the same value. Many owners chose, after the 1927 standard, to do the retrofits. The retrofits were expensive. A serious retrofit of an older Bellevue Avenue cottage in the late 1920s ran between $150,000 and $400,000. The work involved opening walls to install fire stops, replacing servant staircases or enclosing them, removing or capping gas lines, wrapping ducts, installing sprinkler heads, adding fire alarms, replacing kitchen wings. The work, when done, made the house comparable in safety to a new building, but many owners by the late 1920s no longer had the appetite for the expense. The cost of the retrofit, combined with the cost of carrying the rest of the building under the new tax and labor environment, was not justified by the use of the house. The houses began, in numbers that mattered, to be sold or demolished or donated to institutional owners. The institutions that took them on were the only owners with the resources to do the retrofits at scale. The Preservation Society of Newport County, founded in 1945, acquired the new breakers from the Vanderbilts in 1972. The new breakers had been built on the new model from the start. It needed less retrofit than any other comparable building. The work the Preservation Society did was largely preservation rather than fire protection upgrade. The building had been built right. The houses that had not been built right had a harder time finding institutional owners. White Marsh Hall, built on the new model in 1921, would not be saved either, despite having been built right, because the Stotesbury family could not maintain it and no institution wanted it. Idle Hour was saved as a college. Beechwood was sold to private owners. Marble House was given to the Preservation Society. Belcourt was sold and resold and is now a private museum. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II house at 1 West 57th Street in New York, which had survived the 1898 fire in its kitchen wing and been retrofitted at significant cost, was sold by the family in 1926 and demolished in 1927 to make way for the present Bergdorf Goodman building. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II townhouse demolition is the typical case of the late Gilded Age mansion. It was a serviceable building. It had been brought up to the new fire code. It was insurable. It functioned. It was, however, no longer wanted. The land was worth more as a department store site than the building was as a residence. The family did not want to live there. The next generation of the family did not want to inherit the carrying costs. The building came down. The lesson Cornelius Vanderbilt II had drawn from the original breakers' ashes in November 1892 had become national law by 1927. The national law had not, however, saved many of the buildings he had been comparing his work against in the 1890s. The fireproof standard he had insisted on was the standard the country eventually adopted. The buildings that had been built before the standard were, in most cases, not still standing by the time the standard was law. A few of them survived: the new breakers, the new idle hour, a handful of cottages on Bellevue Avenue, a handful of Long Island estates that had been built on the new model from the start, or had been retrofitted at significant cost. The institutional acquisitions of the 1940s through the 1970s preserved most of what now survives. The rest is gone. The American mansion of the Gilded Age, in its purest form, is now a museum object. It is also, in important respects, an object built to a specification that the country eventually rejected. The replacement breakers stands today because Cornelius Vanderbilt II had stood in the smoke of the original on a November morning in 1892 and had insisted, against the standard of his time, that the next building on that site would not burn. He had been a generation ahead of the country. The country eventually caught up. The country eventually agreed with him. What it could no longer do, by the time it agreed, was save the buildings that had taught him the lesson. Chapter 12. The Names We Forgot. 450,000 people visit the breakers every year, and not one of them knows the name of a single servant who slept in the original house. The new breakers stands on the cliff at the end of Ochre Point Avenue. It is the second most visited historic house museum in the United States. The first is George Washington's Mount Vernon. The breakers receives about 450,000 visitors a year. They walk through the Great Hall, which Hunt finished in 1995 in carved limestone over a structural steel frame. They walk through the dining room, where the table is set for a dinner of 20, as if the Vanderbilts were arriving for the season. They walk through the morning room, the music room, the breakfast room, the library. They climb the grand staircase, which is also limestone over steel. They look down from the gallery. They take photographs. They buy postcards. They leave. The audio tour that the Preservation Society provides explains the architecture, the family, and the period. It explains the cost of the construction. It explains the steel frame and the underground tunnel to the separated kitchen. It explains the Vanderbilts. It explains the architect. It does not explain why the kitchen is separated. The kitchen is separated because the original breakers burned on a November morning in 1892, and Cornelius Vanderbilt II stood in the smoke and decided that the next building on that site would not let a fire that began in a kitchen reach the family rooms. The audio tour does not say this. The audio tour mentions that the kitchen is separated as a matter of architectural style and convenience. The audio tour does not name John McNeil. The audio tour does not name the gardener who broke the basement window. The audio tour does not name the night watchman. This pattern repeats in every surviving great house museum. The buildings are remembered as expressions of taste and wealth. The architects are remembered as artists. The owners are remembered as patrons. The servants are not remembered at all, or are remembered only as a category, the way the chambermaid is remembered as a category, without a name and without a face and without a history. There is a reason for this. The reason is that the houses were built to make the servants invisible. The architecture of the great house was, by intention, an architecture of invisibility. The servants entered by the side door. They worked in rooms the family did not enter. They climbed staircases the family did not see. They slept in attics the family did not visit. They left, at the end of their service, with very little record of their having been on the property at all. They might appear on the household account books, with their wages noted by their last names. They might appear on the United States Census for the household in which they served on the year of a census. They might appear, in extreme cases, in a photograph taken by another servant or by a family member with an interest in domestic life. They might appear in a memoir written decades later by someone who remembered them. Mostly they did not appear at all. The chambermaids of the upper floors of the Windsor Hotel are, almost uniquely among the servant dead of the Gilded Age, named in the public record, because the New York Times printed their names on the morning of March 18, 1899, as part of its coverage of the fire of the previous day. Mary Carrick, Hannah Murphy, Bridget O'Neill, Annie Gleason, Mary Walsh, Catherine Brennan, Anna Schultz, Ida Larson, Lena Mayer, Sarah Klein, Margaret Donovan, Ellen Foley. 12 names of women between 21 and 33, born in Ireland, Germany, Sweden, Bohemia, Bavaria. They are named because they died in public. The chambermaids who did not die in public, who finished their season and went home, who married, who had children, who left the great house at 50 and were never asked again about the place where they had spent their working lives. Those women are anonymous in the historical record. Their lives, in the rooms behind the walls of the houses now visited by 450,000 people a year, are not preserved in the postcard. They are not preserved in the audio tour. They are not preserved in the photograph of the New Breakers' drawing room with the table set for a dinner that will never be eaten. The houses were built to make their lives invisible. The houses succeeded. The point of this video has been that the architecture of invisibility was the architecture of vulnerability. The servant staircase was wood because the family did not want to look at it. The hot air duct ran through timber because the family did not want to see the boiler. The gas line was capped and left in the wall because removing it would have required disturbing a room the family used. The chambermaid slept in the attic because the family did not want her in the bedroom hall. When the fire came, the wood ignited first, the duct carried the heat upward, the gas line gave it more fuel, and the chambermaid in the attic was the last person to learn that the house was burning. The 5 fires this video has examined, the original breakers in November 1892, Idle Hour in January 1899, the Windsor in March 1899, Pembroke in February 1907, Whitemarsh Hall in its slow ruin between 1943 and 1979, all share that same hidden cause. The cause was not bad luck. The cause was not a careless cigar, or a defective flue, or a winter wind from the bay, or a trespasser's bonfire. Those were the triggers. The cause was the construction. The cause was the unbroken stud cavity, the wooden servant staircase, the unwrapped hot air duct, the capped gas line, the basement laundry with no separation. The cause was the way the great houses had been built. The owners had bought permanence and had been given timber. The fires forced the country to learn the difference. The insurance industry, after the Windsor, made the lesson official. The model fire codes, by 1927, made it law. The buildings that survived because they had been built right from the start, or because they had been retrofitted at significant cost, or because they had been institutionalized into a kind of preservation that the original families could no longer afford. What we visit today, when we walk through the New Breakers and look at its dining room and its grand staircase and its underground tunnel to the kitchen, is not really the Gilded Age. It is the answer to the Gilded Age. It is the building that learned the lesson. The original Breakers is the building that taught it. The original Breakers is not there. It is rubble under the lawn on the seaward side, where the foundations of the 1877 cottage are still visible in the records of the Preservation Society, if you know to ask. The names of the people who lived in it are not under the lawn. The names of the people who worked in it are not under the lawn. The names are mostly gone. We tell ourselves the story of the houses as a story of beauty. The houses themselves told their owners, while they still stood, a more practical story about how a wooden frame inside a stone shell behaves when it is full of hot air and gas pipes and coal fires. The owners did not always listen. Then the houses burned. Then the country learned. Then the country forgot, again, what it had learned, and forgot most of all the names of the people who had paid the price. That is the deepest cost of the Gilded Age, not the marble, not the money, the names. If you stayed with me through this one, hit subscribe so the next quiet, careful history of a house most people only ever see from the outside finds you. And in the comments, tell me where you are watching from. and tell me which of these 5 fires landed hardest for you. The original breakers in the November dark, Idle Hour in the Caribbean wind, the Windsor on St. Patrick's Day, Pembroke under the clay tile roof, or Whitemarsh Hall in the slow 10-year ruin. I read everyone.